Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jonathan Binstock. I'm the director here at the Memorial Art Gallery. I'm delighted to welcome you for this day-long symposium, this conference on HIV/AIDS Histories called Speaking Through Silence. I want to begin by reading the Memorial Art Gallery's land acknowledgement, and then we'll get on with the introduction proper. The Memorial Art Gallery of the University of Rochester sits on the lands of the Haudenosaunee people, specifically the Seneca Nation. These lands were the traditional territory of the Seneca prior to their removal through invasion and occupation, as well as deceptive and broken agreements. The lands continue to serve as home to the native peoples and cultures who have lived here for centuries. Stories of creation, ancestors, spiritual life, and the struggle for survival and identity live today in this land. We honor the rich culture, heritage, and contributions of native peoples and their stewardship of the land that we now occupy. We are keenly aware of the role that museums have played in contributing to the struggles faced by Native Americans. As an art museum, we are committed to working toward dismantling the systems of oppression that have impacted the lives of Native Americans, both historically and presently. We are committed to working across all facets of our institution to address the long history of the invisibility of Native Americans. We aim to promote the important and myriad contributions to art, culture, and society of Native Americans in order to effect positive change in our community. Well, this is an exciting moment, and it's one we've been working toward with our partner, the University of Rochester's River Campus Libraries, for more than 5 years. The exhibition, Up Against the Wall, and now today's important conference, are enabling MAG and the University of Rochester to reach out to and engage a broad variety of audiences and segments of our community. And at the MAG, this is what we live for. This is what we do. This is the essence of our mission, to use art to bring people together and make new conversations, new learning experiences, and new meaning possible. We are grateful for this opportunity, and I want to thank you all once again for coming today. To this end, I'd like to this end of engaging the community, I'd like to note that there is a satellite exhibition of works from the AIDS Education Poster Collection on view right now at RIT's University Gallery through April 8th. Today's conference is the result of close collaboration, not only with colleagues at the University of Rochester, but also with those at Rochester Institute of Technology and Cornell University. For this, I would like to thank the two conference organizers, Dr. Tamar Carroll, Associate Professor and Chair of History at RIT, and Dr. Stephen Veeder, Assistant Professor of History and Director of the Public History Initiative at Cornell University. From my distant view of this conference, I can tell that it is a behemoth. And so the complexity of organizing such a program is greatly appreciated. And thank you both, Dr. Carroll and Dr. Veeder. I also want to acknowledge the work of the incredible MAG Academic Programs Department and my colleague, Dr. Niall Blunt, and his team. And a very special thank you to Chiyo Ueyama, who really, I think, managed the full range of details regarding this program. So thank you, Chiyo. The symposium is sponsored by the Central New York Humanities Corridor from an award by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and by the University of Rochester Humanities Center. Additional support has been provided by MAG, RIT's College of Liberal Arts, UR's River Campus Libraries, and the Cornell Public History Initiative. Admission to MAG for conference attendees is made possible in part by LGBT Plus Fund for the Greater Rochester at Rochester Area Community Foundation. Finally, I'd like to offer a special thank you to our presenters and attendees who have traveled from out of town to be here. We're really excited to be hosting visitors and welcoming people back to the auditorium, to the MAG. So thank you all for making the trip. And for anyone not able to join us today, the presentations will be recorded and made available on the website of the Cornell University Public History Initiative. And now, I'd like to invite Dr. Tamar Carroll, Associate Professor and Chair of History at RIT, to the podium to introduce the keynote speakers. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thanks for being here. I am so excited for this day. I will save my thank yous for my closing remarks at the end of the day. Suffice to say for now that everyone has been wonderful, and we are so grateful to MAG for hosting us today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speakers, Dr. Jennie Brier and Matt Wizinsky. Dr. Jennie Brier is Professor of History and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Her book, Infectious Ideas, U.S. Political Responses to the AIDS Crisis, is often required reading in college courses on medical history, LGBTQ issues, and public health policy. It details how the AIDS epidemic influenced healthcare and foreign policy, reproductive health, gay and lesbian rights, and racial justice. Jennie has been a mentor and a model for me, not only because we both study U.S. women's and gender history, and we both have studied and written about AIDS, but because she has been a leader in the profession and an advocate for women, serving as vice president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, which is a professional organization that advocates and tries to improve the status of women in the profession of history in the U.S. Academy and actually across the globe. Jennie is also, another reason why she's so inspiring is she's also a practicing public historian in addition to her academic scholarship. She co-curated the Chicago History Museum's 2011 award-winning Out in Chicago exhibition. And she also developed Surviving and Thriving, AIDS, Politics, and Culture, which is a traveling exhibition for the National Library of Medicine. She will be talking today about her most recent public history project, History Moves. We're so thrilled that she made the trip out from Chicago to be here with us today. She has collaborated with designer Matt Wizinsky on History Moves. So let me now introduce Matt and tell you a little bit about his work and about History Moves. Matt Wizinsky, who will be joining us via Zoom today, is a designer, researcher, educator, and lecturer on contemporary design practices and design research. He is an associate professor in the Ullman School of Design at University of Cincinnati, associate editor for the Communication Design Research Journal, Visible Language. He's a PhD researcher in transition design at Carnegie Mellon University and principal designer at the consultancy studio Jungle Cat. He is also author of the forthcoming book, Design After Capitalism, which will be published by MIT Press this year, and the design lead for History Moves, which he has been working on with Jennie Brier since 2013. History Moves is a research collaborative that brings together participatory design with public history. By transforming the process of historical production through participatory methods, would-be historical subjects instead become history makers. History Moves partners with community-based organizations to produce untold narratives about how communities have come to be the way they are. We provide tools and facilitate methods that enable communities to connect and contextualize the lived experiences of individual participants. Through participatory workshops, History Moves encourages people to record stories of their lives in conversation with each other and to visualize those stories in order to imagine, interpret, and map their collective pasts. We produce multimedia archives presented publicly through physical exhibitions, digital exhibitions, books, films, and public events built in collaboration with each project's participants. And we are incredibly lucky to have Jennie and Matt with us today to talk about this enormously creative and really significant model of participatory history making. Please join me in welcoming them.
Wow, I mean, I don't know what I should say at this point. That was like a lot. I am so honored to be here. This is my first trip I took a plane for the first time in 2 years. It's also the first time I'm able to share this work with people in real life. And there is something, it's a very powerful experience. I know we've all been on Zoom and we're all experts at Zoom, and many of us have been in classrooms. And so it may not seem that unusual, but a project that is based on being together and having to do it over Zoom for 2 years has really changed what it felt like. And so to get to be here today in such amazing company with so many people who I've thought with and learned from and read with and spoken to, I hope that you're able to see the things that we've made. And so this is my colleague Matt. He's Zooming here from some place in the upper Midwest. I'm not exactly clear on where he is. We are really honored to introduce to you this project that we've been working on since about 2014, which at the time we thought was just going to be a conversation with some women living with HIV. And we realized as we were doing this work that we were actually producing what is a living women's history of HIV in the United States. And that is, the phrase itself, I think, is really quite important. There's the modifiers of history of HIV. So, as Tamar said, I wrote a book called Infectious Ideas, which came out in 2009. And I've been working on the academic history of AIDS since about 1995 when I completed my exams at Rutgers. And so what it means to have written a book about the history of HIV, and I've talked about this with some people, as protease inhibitors were coming online, I wrote an entire book about the history of AIDS without ever fully acknowledging that protease inhibitors existed, because I couldn't have that idea in my mind if I was going to recount something that happened before that existed. So I kind of had to inure myself to that possibility. And the other thing that did in many ways was it kept me from fully understanding, from fully sort of comprehending and integrating what it meant to center people living with HIV, in part because I was writing about a time when so many people had died. And so this project this project really is about what happens when you expand beyond the academic, which is useful for some of us and not for all of us, because some of us aren't stuck there. But if you expand beyond the academic or the professional field of history and really think about what happens when you engage in public history. And by that, I don't just mean exhibitions and programs. I did that after Infectious Ideas came out. I sort of went back to my roots in public history and curated this exhibition, and then I got contacted by the National Library of Medicine, created Surviving and Thriving. Now Ted Kerr has created a second exhibition. It's the most asked for exhibition from the National Library of Medicine. It's been translated into Spanish. It now travels in English and in Spanish. But it was really about what would happen if the people who were the subjects of the history became the historians. And how could I practice what it meant to really, truly be engaged with them as interpreters of history and not just as storytellers. So when Avram talked about storytelling last night, I sort of thought about what it means for us to, academic historians, to really think about how do we share the tools and the sort of capacities of interpretation and significance making beyond an individual recounting of a story. And so it was sort of lucky for me that at that moment, I was sort of imagining this thing called History Moves. And I called it History Moves because I wanted it to be both about the affect, the experience of what happens when you see history, when you are history, right? Because it moves you. But I also, and now it seems so cute, I was like, we can't just live on our phones. We have to be in person. So it was really this idea of a physical mobile space that would engage with people where it was being made, that could be made iteratively and sort of constantly in flux. And of course, I knew some of those things as a historian, but it turned out that I needed to collaborate with someone who thought about history differently than I did. So I live in narrative, I live in words, I live in image analysis, right? I live in primary sources. And it turns out that designers think about and visualize stories in just entirely different ways. And so for me, the collaboration with Matt, when we met at a place called the Innovation Center at UIC, really was to do that. So Matt, can you advance to the next slide? So really, what would happen if public history and participatory design met each other? And then what would happen if those two things met communities or activists or neighborhood groups where they were at? So Matt and I agreed to work together for 10 years. We're just at the edge of that 10 years. Matt and his partner have had 3 children since then. I luckily already had one, so that didn't matter. But it was a complicated, like life intervened in everything, and it made that sort of very decent handshake. There's something that happens when you meet your collaborator that, it's very different than when you just meet a colleague. Like, we have a way of working together and a language for working together that is part of how this works. And so I really saw History Moves as a moment for me to take a break from the history of HIV, because it's hard. It's hard to do that work. It's hard to not, if you don't have the mechanisms to sort of go through the emotion of it, because you're an academic and you're trying to be an academic. It can be be quite complicated. And so we did some projects with some young people in Chicago. We built some stuff, we made things. And then I was actually in the Berkshires one summer, and I met this woman named Marge Cohen, Dr. Marge Cohen, who had been one of the first internists treating women with HIV in the 1980s at Cook County Hospital. Marge Cohen comes from a family of leftists. Her brother, Bobby Cohen, was the chief medical director at Rikers Island for a long time. She integrated the OB ward at Rush, where she went to medical school in the 1970s. She's really a spitfire of a person. And she had started this project called the Women and Children AIDS Project at Cook County in the basement. And I said, oh, I have this project I'm running called History Moves. We should do something. It's the 20th anniversary of the Ys. And she was like, oh yeah, come down, come meet the women from the project. A lot of them have been in the project for 20 years and they've never missed an appointment. Every 6 months they come, they have to get a pap smear, they have to get blood drawn, they have to do all these things, and they're really engaged. And so Matt and I trotted down the street. It was really I think you may have even walked down the street because it's right by the UIC campus. And we sat down at a table. There were probably about 20 of us at the table, Matt and me and these women and a research assistant named Catherine Jett, who now lives out here. And we talked about what they wanted to do and how they wanted to be represented and who they were and how they came to be at that table. We practiced oral history, and then we came up with ideas for what kinds of questions they would ask one another. And then I said, in my best material history, public history question, do you have any objects of everyday life that you sort of think about in relationship to HIV? And every single woman at the table pulled out an orange card from Cook County Hospital, which by this point was called Stroger Hospital. So Cook County Hospital is defunct, right? It became Stroger Hospital. And you can see some of them are quite torn. They're quite worn out. And it says, always bring this card with you. They pull it out of their wallets. And it's 2004, 2016, 2014, 2015, something like that. It's the orange of Guantanamo, it's the orange of Orange is the New Black, but it's also the orange of Cook County Hospital from the 1980s. It is the card that every person who received their care at Cook County, which is the public hospital of Cook County, had that card. And they all carried them in their wallets. And that really became the start of this project. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Jenny. And hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to join you from somewhere in the upper Midwest. And I can't see you, but I'm so pleased to be able to share this work with you. So as Jenny was explaining sort of our meeting and our trying to figure out how we might bring together a form of history making with design, we didn't quite know what that was going to look like, and through some of these early conversations, we were trying to figure out, what does that mean? What does it mean to say that design plays some kind of role in the making of public history, and in what ways can design assist perhaps in making that making of public history become more participatory. And so what we're looking at on the screen now is a drawing that I made, I think in 2014, when we were first starting to figure this out. The original drawing was, I think, about 8 feet long. It was this huge piece of paper, and I was trying to map out, what a process of collecting and interpreting and curating and designing, and then, putting back out into the public and displaying stories, artifacts, archival materials might look like. And what we were uncovering, I think, is that one of the roles that design was going to play in this was to not only to help shape the things that we'd ultimately make. I mean, acknowledging that design strives to produce material culture, not just to study it, but that we needed to make a lot of things on the way. We needed to make tools. We needed to create certain kinds of experiences and certain kinds of conditions that would allow people to share. And it becomes this space where history and design are kind of one thing in the doing of this. And so all the way from the notion of making toolkits, which we did, making toolkits with the kinds of devices that one would need to conduct oral histories and digitize artifacts, and packaging that up in a backpack so we could really kind of mobilize the history collectors, all the way to this crazy idea we had at some point of actually purchasing a bus that we would turn into a mobile gallery to travel around Chicago and both collect and display materials. And I think what this started to tell us was that that the making of artifacts, whether those are digital artifacts or physical artifacts, that this process, it can be a participatory process, and this can be the work that participating people that are part of the communities that we're working with can do with us. And so we when we were working with the WISE group in Chicago, we didn't exactly know what this was going to look like yet, but one of the things that we identified early on is that we had three basic materials that we were working with. We were working with audio, so our project begins with oral history. We transcribe audio into text, so now we have text, and we work with images. We have images that are collected and digitized with the participating women, and we have images that are collected from archives that are relevant to the stories, the times, and the places that the women have shared with us. And so through this process, designing and developing and making tools like contact sheets of text as well as contact sheets of images, making posters that are really sort of blank spaces as invitations for the women to work together, to stitch together their words and stitch together their images, to identify themes that emerge from their own individual stories, and realize that making a book is actually a really great way to do this. Making a book is a great way to bring together text and images. So we landed in the work with the women in Chicago on making a book. See the first version of it here, and you can probably quickly identify the orange color from the cards that Jennie was describing, some nod to the redaction that was a part of our process to maintain elements of anonymity where the women wanted it. But what this allowed us to do was to sit around that table in Chicago and to pass around transcripts and pass around images and work together to really combine and make an element of material culture that became a collective story and a participatory model of making this history. So we use that bookmaking process as kind of the starting point for the work that we do. And from there, from that same body of material, that same collection of images, audio, and text, we then took the material that we put into the book and distilled it even further. We made a short film that was about 10 minutes long, almost entirely narrated by the women's stories from their oral history, with text and images carrying that narrative. And then we translate that same material again into a traveling exhibition. You see some images at the bottom there. This was an exhibition that was also co-designed and produced with a group of undergraduate design students at the University of Cincinnati, working with the material that we had produced with the women in Chicago. It was an exhibition that brought together text, images, audio, all of those same three elements, but was specifically designed to be able to travel and to be sort of modular and adaptable to different kinds of locations. And so it was really important to us in the way that Jennie described the moves part of history moves, that this material goes back into public spaces, occupies and produces new space in the neighborhoods and cities where the stories came from. So this exhibition traveled to several venues all over Chicago in 2016 and 2017, and sort of created the kind of process that History Moves has continued to develop in working on the project towards a living women's history of HIV in the United States.
Thank you, Matt. So we were making all these things, and it was kind of magical. It was also like, I joke and say it was like the lesbian nation. Like, I called people up and I was like, can you come unpack a U-Haul? Because we need to move this exhibition from the south side to the west side. And we like hired theater, like underemployed theater folks to come and set up the sets. And it was this really amazing process. And that exhibition, when it was at one of the libraries on the west side of Chicago in a neighborhood called Garfield Park that has suffered profound disinvestment and the sort of effects of structural racism, we put it up. We couldn't put all of it up. There wasn't enough room. But I remember being there and hearing people be like, oh, that's my corner, that's my, and it was there, and there was something about that moment that was really powerful. We had an opportunity, once we made these things from Chicago, to share with the project that Marge was a part of, the Women's Interagency HIV Study, the WISE, which is the longest running longitudinal study of the natural history of HIV in female bodies. And we agreed to bring some of the stuff to the CAB, which those of you who know stuff about how big medical studies work is the Community Advisory Board. So that's the board where women from all of the sites are present. And we brought the film that we had made there, and women from all over the place wanted to join the project. We got a small grant from Mac Makeup to expand the project to 2 sites. We chose Brooklyn, New York, where I am from in many ways. This is at SUNY Downstate, which is across the street from Kings County Hospital. And we chose the site for the WISE at UNC in Raleigh-Durham. The southern states had been added to the WISE in the 2000s. As we know, the way the US epidemic has emerged and evolved over the last 40 plus years has been to become a largely southern epidemic. But what became really clear was that while I had connections to Brooklyn, like that's where I'm from, it was hard to do a project like this if you weren't down the street. Because being down the street is part of that contact, right? And so this was 2016. We expanded to these other sites. And then the challenges of distance and the challenges of our lives as people intervened. And then there was this election. And then there was a second pandemic. And then it became clear, and we're going to move into hearing the women in a second, but it became clear that not all of the women were going to be living. And I think that that was a moment for me of profound, it was hard to deal with in many ways, and I know it's not unique to me. I'm not so narcissistic as to think that, but I had called this a living women's history of HIV because, one, it's important to have women at the center of a history if you're going to understand the history. And women change, when you put women at the center of a story, it changes everything. It changes the period of time, it changes the significance, it changes who you look to, it changes how you look. You look sideways instead of head on, you look backwards instead of forwards, sorry. But they were also living. And then some of the women did die. And it was hard to process because we had called it a living women's history of HIV, and so I really thought that they were all going to be alive, and then it wasn't. So it was really, though, about creating relationships They grew their relationships with one another. I mean, some of them had known each other for 20 years. But to sit down with somebody and do an interview where you interview one person and then you switch is an incredibly intimate moment. And they had that, and then some of them didn't know each other at all and had other kinds of intimate moments, and we got to be a part of that. And there are plenty of oral historians here who can talk more about that, but the experience of being part of that and not being one of the drivers of it, I think, was really important. So there were these constraints, but still, we really had a principle of what we were doing. So we're going to show you a few more slides, and then we're going to play we're going to show you some examples. So we made this book. You want to do that, Matt, and then I'll go on to the next stuff.
Sure. So the sort of bookmaking as a process of participatory assembly and collection of stories through text and images continued in the other sites where we brought the project, and we will show you in a little bit here, but we've recently completed this 3-volume series of books. Each one's about 200 pages long, so they're pretty substantial volumes, one dedicated to one of the sites, and each one both a sort of public outcome of the work that we've done with the women in these 3 locations, but also really kind of one of the centerpieces of the work that we did together and sort of how we did that work together. And so these books are now available. We have copies that we've made for everybody in the project. We have PDF versions that can be downloaded and shared, and we also have some print-on-demand options for people who want physical copies of the book.
And all of it can be found, we'll show you on our website. So to really give you that's a sort of frame for it, but to give you one of the other principles of this project that comes out of both women's history and studying the history of HIV is that we can't focus immediately on hearing one story. It's not just the danger of a single story, but that actually we have a kind of we're drawn to individual story and we get lost in that individuality. And part of what we're trying to do is, through dialogue, really think about how you can always hear the cacophony and then focus in after, right? So that it's about recognizing the larger whole and then focusing on the individual. So you can see these are pictures of the interviews happening. Those are pictures of the work that the women did on the upper right corner in the workshops. They would sort of paste things up. And then those are the examples of the kinds of what it looks like to see it in a text.
And as we have attempted to embody that principle in the way that we've worked, we've also tried to keep that idea central in the kinds of outputs that we create. And so, for example, in the books that we've created, we consider the way that a spread in a book sort of forces you to combine multiple quotes, multiple voices. We attempt to foreground that sort of listening or reading or looking at the overarching narrative about the intersections of individual lives, about emergent themes, even as they may be distant in time or place, without sacrificing the individual voice and the individual story. But you can see, I mean, even small decisions like in the books, we keep a citation for each quote quite small and at the bottom of the page, which is not maybe a totally radical idea, but we really want to foreground the words said by each woman. And then at the end of the book, each woman has a spread dedicated to her individual narrative. So it's almost like each woman's story has been kind of distributed across the big collective historical narrative, and then she has the chance to be reassembled at the end of the book. So each book ends with a section called Meet the Women, where we have all of the images that each woman has shared through the project, as well as a kind of poetic, distilled version of the story that she told. And we've attempted to carry this through in all of the media that we've created, even with this exhibition that I was describing that we did with the women in Chicago. We asked visitors or invited visitors to the exhibition to pick up a card as they walk in, and each card had a kind of a typographic symbol on it, all of the quotes and all of the images were cited with this symbol rather than a name. And so the idea was that you were to kind of immerse yourself in the whole history, and yet you were maybe following along with one of these symbols, but you didn't quite know who it was. And then at the end of the exhibition, there was a full wall of Meet the Women, and you could sort of uncode and get the full story of which woman you were maybe paying a little more attention to as you moved through the story. So I'm going to share now, we talked about some of the physical objects that we've made. We also, in part in response to COVID, did move to making some digital exhibitions. And again, we've stuck with our three primary materials. We have audio, we have text, we have images. And so on this website, we've attempted to put together three different kinds of exhibition with the material that we've aggregated from all three of the sites. And so under the C section of the site, we have a collection of narratives organized under specific titles, questions. And if you click in any one of these, for example, how can we center women in the history of HIV/AIDS? We've collected individual quotes that we think are significant to the organizing theme. We sort of animated those as you enter each story to highlight some of the key themes that emerged directly from the women's words, their oral histories. And as you scroll through, start to contextualize the historical materials, individual quotes from women at all three locations, as well as some personal images that they've shared with us through the process. Under the read section, you have access to the books that I was just describing, so you can get a little bit of an idea of what's in these books, the historical images, the aggregation of quotes, personal images shared by the women, and have access for each one of these to download or grab a book through print on demand. And then under the Here section, this is where we were able to pull together. We have over 300 excerpts from the oral history interviews, and they're organized and connected in a way so that you can experience them in a way that's almost conversational, so that you can select a topic, something that we want to talk about, and it starts to play women's voices from all three locations talking about these topics. I want to play for you this one, the topic which is HIV Saved My Life.
I've been doing pretty good. Like I said, I'm still on the same regiment, but I really look at it as a blessing, really, in a sense, because if I hadn't found out I was positive, I wouldn't be looking on the brighter side and doing better things for myself. Right. I might not have seeked housing, you know, I might still have been out there.
Me too.
So, yeah, I look at it as a blessing.
Like before I was diagnosed, I say the same thing now, that I never really was happy with myself. I wasn't happy with myself and didn't know why I wasn't happy. It was like I wasn't connected. I was existing, but I was not living with myself. I was existing, I was not living. And I remember when after I suffered 2 months, I was in my house before I was diagnosed and went in the hospital, and like a breeze came to me and told me that I'm gonna borrow you for a minute. And when I was in the hospital for that month, it was like I was in the hospital to introduce me, to connect with me, have feelings for myself, to find myself, to rest and find myself. And my accomplishment now is the relationship that I have with myself. That I don't have to be in a relationship with a man. I'm in a relationship with myself.
There you go.
HIV definitely saved my life. I knew enough to know I didn't want to die. You know, and that meant getting clean, getting sober. You know, I had one thing attacking my body like it was a hungry lion. You know, and then I threw drugs and alcohol in the mix, and you know, my body was like, girl, I'm gonna quit on you if you don't stop. HIV definitely saved my life.
Oh, those quotes are just so incredible. Rosalind and Carol are from Brooklyn, and Deborah is from Chicago. I just want to say that the phrase HIV saved my life in many ways is what this project became about. And it changed fundamentally my thinking about HIV and the history of it. It changed fundamentally. It really was the belief that the people who were the historical subjects were the historical interpreters. You don't get to have your interpretation of this pandemic be only defined by looking at documents from people who aren't living and who have had a very different relationship to HIV. And it's just, for me, the phrase HIV saved my life is symbolic of what it means to look at a living women's history of HIV as different from any other kind of history of HIV. So this is Cordelia. Cordelia's there in the middle of that lower left-hand corner with me and a AIDS activist from Chicago named Mary Patton, who some of you will know if you know ACT UP in Chicago. Cordelia is up there at the corner. That's little Cordelia standing at the tree by her house in Englewood, the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago. And we're just going to introduce you to her to show you how this worked. So Cordelia brought that photograph, and then we pixelated that photograph to sort of estrange you from it. And then she appears here in the exhibition. And then Matt, why don't you play the first quote, and then we'll play the second quote.
Basically, I'm 50 years old. I am from a family of 7 children. I had one brother who is deceased now, and I still have 6 sisters, and I'm the baby of the bunch, as they usually say, the black sheep and all that good stuff. Right. And basically, you know, growing up for us was real nice, because my mom and dad were both from Mississippi, and so they were kind of old-fashioned, and they didn't believe in SOB kids, which I'm quite sure you know what that means. I want to be a little discreet here. They didn't believe in children out of wedlock at all, okay? And they didn't believe in us dating or even thinking about having a boyfriend to bring to the house and introduce to them until we were 16 years old. But of course, me being the baby and a spoiled brat of the 6 girls, I was sneaking around anyway.
And then this is Cordelia and Matt talking as they were scanning this image.
That's basically the gist of it, and till today I'm surviving and enjoying life. And like I tell people, as much as I try to die, seemed like the more I tried to die, the more I would live. You know, I
It's
was
not having you.
drugs, drinking. You know, I'm trying to take myself out. I'm like, okay, well, I must be here for something. You know, so I kind of really feel like, you know, that, you know, that you know, and my faith in God and everything is keeping me here to take care of my daddy like my mom would have done.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm
Yeah, that's great.
just doing what I'm supposed to do when I can do it and all of that.
So speaking through silence and what it will take to produce a living women's history of HIV that is public facing, that is about a wide range of audiences. There is still no academic women's history of HIV. It doesn't exist yet. And I think that part of what we see here is really an attempt to see what it will take to produce this kind of history. It cannot be done through archival research alone. It can't be done without involving the people who are part of the story. That's Claire Steen there, who passed away in 2018. One thing I wanted to say is, obviously, this is an important image at the upper right-hand corner. That's the version that appeared on a Chicago bus, and you'll notice that it doesn't have the bottom line of it about corporate greed. It was incredibly controversial in Chicago, right? There were huge protests about it. Not a single woman in the project had experienced anything in relationship to it. And that was just, it was an important thing to sort of name that their histories really didn't intersect with the histories that we've in many ways told ourselves are the keys to unlocking it. And so it was just for us this moment of clarity about what needed to be in the mix. So I know we're long. Matt, do you want to just go to the last page and say one thing, and then I will too, and we'll stop.
Sounds great. So this is our, did you want to listen to Alicia?
No, go ahead, say a little, and then we'll let Alicia have the last word.
Okay, great. Well, I was only going to say back here, I mean, this question about how do we, begin to make this public history of women living with HIV, and particularly a living history. We've seen many of these images throughout the presentation, but this is kind of how we have imagined it, and I think this is how we've imagined, at least from my standpoint, how design has some way of bringing a process and also the making of material culture, putting it into the hands of the would-be historical subjects so that they become not the anonymous subjects, but actually the authors, the designers, the producers of this history. And the last slide we're going to share here, and the last little audio clip, is from Alicia, who was one of the participants from North Carolina. This is her spread from the North Carolina book with her images and some of the words she shared, and we'll listen to her, let her end it for us.
I'm grateful for, I wouldn't change the diagnosis. People say, would you go back? Go back for what? It's too much to go back to. Honestly, I've met more people. I've been able to do a whole lot as an advocate and a woman living with HIV. I've been able to help other women, connect with other women, network with other women, come up with ideas so that we can help make an impact on our community and dispel myths and stop stigma. It's just been great. And even during the research studies, I always say yes. I don't say no. There are a lot of people who are afraid of research, even if it is questioning, because, just fear of lack of knowing. Years ago, it's always said, what goes on in the house stays in the house. Don't tell people your business. But a lot of these things help other people. And that's what I'm about, helping other people. So if I can be a part of it, heck yeah. So that's it, because I'll keep talking.
Thank you.
So I had prepared an image deck, but we're running a little over, and I think I just want to make a few comments about this elegant, exquisite, comprehensive work by Jennie and Matthew, which is, I'd love to sort of set the stage for a historical cushion to this work, which has to do with the work that was done decades ago, but still isn't a part of the AIDS historiography as we conceive it. And we'll be exploring many of those struggles throughout this, this conference, but it all stems out of the conundrum of an AIDS historiography that reifies the past rather than helping us situate the present or the future. We're going to generally capped at the advent of the pharmaceutical interventions offering viral suppression in patients with access and predicated on the presumptive neutrality of whiteness and pharmaceutical property rights sort of serves the institutional power structures by solidifying an intricate ecosystem of narratives that are best suited to the institutions that profit from defining survival of HIV/AIDS solely in medical terms. And one of the tragedies of the historiography, the dominant narrative of AIDS, is that it completely obliterates the contribution by women working around HIV/AIDS from the beginning. I was a part of the affinity group in ACT UP that pressured the CDC to include the manifestations of immunosuppression in women. And for the first 12 years, the CDC ignored the clinical data. So not only were women dying of AIDS, they were dying 6 times faster than men, and they were undiagnosed. And moreover, the indicators at the time that we used for making an assessment of HIV/AIDS, their doctors wouldn't even consider the testing that would be necessary in order for us to begin to make that diagnosis. So they were dying without a diagnosis of AIDS. And I think it's a tragedy of the past that story, in addition to these beautiful contemporary documentation of the ongoing HIV/AIDS pandemic, that those stories have been sort of written out of the history because they don't serve the larger heroic story that's based on white men fighting the system and being involved in the decision-making process in the FDA and the NIH, which is a great narrative, and it's true, and it's appealing, and it's heroic, but it completely obliterates not just the story of women and AIDS and the contribution by women to the AIDS activist work, and in truth, ACT UP was completely based on the women's health movement from the 70s. Like everything that we have come to relate to is the canon, the historiography, as I call it, the dominant canon, ignores the contribution of women. And in fact, the Women's Caucus and ACT UP did work that was not dissimilar from what we saw today. Coalition work with women in prison, and it went on for 4 years, and the CDC kept, sort of submitting adaptations that were not acceptable, and we kept rejecting them until they finally changed the definition to include women 12 years into the pandemic. So I think it's super important as we assemble to sort of think about the history of AIDS and the ongoing history, and as archivists and people working in this space and historians, it's super important to realize that any history of AIDS, and I reject the very idea of it because it's an ongoing pandemic, any history has to begin with an archaeological dig to excavate all of the work that's been done in all of these areas, in communities of color, women with AIDS, not just the protease inhibitors, which sort of cap the story, like everyone thinks AIDS is over because of protease inhibitors, but what happens to people who fall outside the penumbra of access to that development? I think this is a really startling and elegant, beautiful project that you've done. But we're going to skip my deck because are we going to do Q&A? Yeah, I think we should.
Thank you so much for such an amazing talk. I just was wondering, do the women, do they feel that in light of the COVID pandemic that HIV has been sort of pushed to the side, and a lot of the resources I know have been like reallocated towards COVID, resources that have been put to the side for HIV/AIDS have been reallocated towards COVID-19 outreach. So are they feeling this on the ground?
Yeah, I'm in touch with many of the women, not all of them, and I've actually heard them talk more about what it's like to be scared of COVID while living with HIV than about the resource question. So like how they're caring for how they're caring for themselves and their families, and also what it means to, as we know, and this is, I think, one of the really important things about this project, is that biomedical solutions are not solutions that make people healthy. They may suppress a virus, but they don't, in fact, make people healthy. And so the kinds of things that they have accrued through being HIV positive, whether it's housing or certain kinds of transportation, certain kinds of childcare, and now a lot of it's grandchild care, you know, how the pandemic has affected, how COVID pandemic has affected those things is part of what I hear. But I haven't heard about a kind of fundamental shift in resources, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening. It's just not what they're talking about. And I guess I would say, I actually think that there are, I mean, maybe it's because I'm looking at a group of people who have tried to write against this larger historiography that I think exists as a foil in things like the fact that we talk about surviving a plague as the only historical source on the history of HIV, or now even Let the Record Show, which is an incredibly important book, but there's a lot of history written about things that are other than that. And I think we have to stop talking about the foil of survive a plague and that, and like we can sort of say, like, to look at Tamar's work, or to look at Stephen's work, or to look at some of my early work, or to look at the work of Darius Bost or Dan Royals. Like, there are people who are growing this history, and we have to start to let that be the thing that defines what we know about the past. Because I think there's been some incredible work. Ted's work, Alex Juhas's work, the work that Ted and I do together with an incredible group of people called What Would an HIV Doula Do? Like, there's lots of it. We had a whole series, AIDS Is, AIDS Ain't 40. like understanding the roots of AIDS and its relationship, particularly to Black gay men and Black gay men's cultural production through the sort of taking of the phrase from Marlon Riggs's film. All of Marlon Riggs's work, like there's lots of it, and we don't have a way yet to hold it in our sights. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really amazing and thought-provoking. I really appreciated how you talked about what is a women's history of AIDS and what that brings. I wonder if you could also touch on what is a Black history of HIV and AIDS?
They're not distinct. Yeah. So one of the people you didn't meet is a woman named Marta, who is Latina, light-skinned Latina. I think she's one of the longest-term surviving women with HIV in the country. Her son just turned 41 this month, and they are both HIV infected and alive. She lives down the block from UIC. The story of Black women is obviously one of the most important stories of the women's history of HIV. It is, in fact, that. It's a story that's grounded in the 70s. It's a story that starts with a range of economic and political and healthcare events of the 1970s, including obviously the lead up to the drug war of the 1980s, but changes in the way public health is provided in major cities. It's a story about how the blood products industry monetizes certain blood products and what it means for poor people to have no choice but to sell their bodies in that form, and what that means for a group of people who are pooling blood. It's a story that starts that has a piece of the Black diaspora in it. So if you look at the Black women's history of HIV in a place like Miami, it's gonna look very different than it does in the Bronx. And it's a story about the Haitian diaspora. It's a story about migration patterns and the kinds of economic forces that move people out of their homelands and into other places. There is, of course, what you can't see is that at the bottom of that poster it says famous last words. AIDS was never a white man's disease. So we have to stop sort of starting there. So instead of saying it was never, we just have to start from a different place. It's always been a Black women's history. And we have to figure out how to tell that and what that does to the way we tell the story moving on.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this rich and wonderful presentation. And I loved what you were saying about participatory design and public history. And you said something about historical subjects as historical interpreters. And I wanted to ask you about the subjects as well as curators, as organizers, as designers of their own history. And if you could talk more about the curatorial process of that, even just identifying terms such like key terms or geographies or how does this content become not just generated but organized in distinct ways based on this collective community knowledge, and how do you gain the trust of communities in creating that dialogue and content and curation?
Do you want to ask your question and then I'll or do you?
No, I can wait.
You wait. Okay, thanks. So in a couple ways, and I'll be quick about it, but you'll see when you look at the digital audio interface, there are terms that might seem like academic, and then there are terms that are clearly generated by the women narrators. So that's one way, is like thinking about terminology and the kinds of words that we use to group things together. I mean, there's some incredible work by people like Jessica Marie Johnson about how indexing and cataloging is a violence. And we were very conscious of what it meant to sort of categorize things in different kinds of terms. And I know there are a lot of librarians here, so I don't mean to like cast aspersions, but it is a complicated thing. The other way is through that physical, like they would meet each other on a wall with a quote in their hands, and they would be like, that's my quote, and she would be like, no, that's my quote, and then it would produce something in that moment, right? And they would go to that photograph. Actually, on the upper right-hand corner is a photograph of an old, the elevated train in Brooklyn. That's, I think it's Franklin Street Station. And it's not the photograph, it's not the station itself where they met each other in that wall. It's the building behind it was where someone would go to shoot up. And so they said, oh, that's my building. Like, I got freaky in that building, and then someone else was like, that's my train station. So it is about what happens in the moment of that interpretive dialogue. Yeah. And then in lots of other ways, like the students who designed that exhibition like had a bunch of ideas. We did a design review with the women in Chicago, and they were like, yeah, no, that's not going to work. So you have to change it all. And the students were freaked out, but that's what they did. They changed it. Has to be the last one. Yes, ma'am.
Wow. I actually don't have a question. I have more of a comment because I'm taking in everything that you've said and the other questions, and the thing that stuck with me where you were saying that this is a Black women's history. And what struck me in how that comes out in listening to the narratives and the fact of you hear the call and response. Yes. And I just wanted to express how appreciative I was that you left in all the utterances within the narratives, because it hits me of like, yes, this is the way that we speak. This is the way that we commune. And it reinforces the idea that this is a communal project in all aspects, right? And then what you just articulated as well in the way that even the geographies and what gets shared in between. And so I just really wanted to express my appreciation for that. And I guess if any question, I'd just be like, can we get tissues next time that we do something like this? Because we need them. So I just want to just say thank you. Thank you to Matt. This is just an extraordinary project, and it's really, I'm going to be sitting with this for many, many days.
Thank you. Thank you.